Hey everyone, welcome back to Engelbart Gaming. I've got a lot of ground to cover here today, so I'm going to keep this intro short. This is going to show you every Taito published game that was released for the Sega Genesis/Mega Drive, and a few other Taito properties that might have been published by someone else. I made my own nebulous rules for what exactly counts as a Taito game, because otherwise this video could have like 100 games in it. Well, not quite that much, but you get the point. I didn't include any of the Toaplan arcade ports of games that Taito published or distributed in the arcades, stuff like Truxton, Hellfire, things like that. I didn't include any of the Double Dragon series, even though Taito distributed those in some regions, and a few other things like that. Why? Well, because Taito didn't have the home rights to those games for any console platform. If I included those, it would be sort of akin to including R-Type in an episode about Nintendo games. Did you know Nintendo distributed the arcade version of R-Type in the US? Well, you do now. Anyway, enough chattering. Let's get on with it. We begin with Cadash. Taito released Cadash into the arcades in 1989. It's a weird, sort of longer form action RPG, something that definitely wasn't ever common in an arcade setting. It tells a pretty rudimentary story, but overall it's kind of fun. You have 4 characters to pick from that all played a little bit differently. You gained levels, collected money, bought items and equipment. It was all very RPG-y. It wasn't the most polished experience, and the action wasn't super compelling, but it was fun. Taito brought Cadash to the Genesis in 1992. It's a pretty good port of the arcade original despite being visually scaled back to fit on a teeny tiny 4 megabit cartridge. That's 512 kilobytes. The animation has been trimmed significantly on the characters and enemies, some transitional areas have been removed, and the biggest offense, 2 of the 4 playable characters have been cut. But how is it besides that? Well, like I said, pretty good. Don't let the cuts fool you, this is a quality action RPG for the Genesis. Now, Cadash was also ported to the PC Engine/TurboGrafx 16. You might be wondering which port is better then. Here's what I'll say on that topic. The PCE version has all 4 characters from the arcade game, but the graphics are very cartoonified and in my opinion look dramatically worse than the Genesis port or arcade original. The gameplay also feels a bit off in that version compared to the original arcade game. Out of the 2, I prefer the authenticity of the Genesis version, but I pretty much always play as the fighter, so I didn't have to deal with missing my favorite character. If you're a fan of playing as the ninja, well, you might prefer the PCE version, despite the fact that it looks and plays different and doesn't sound as good. Anyway, Genesis Cadash is a good game. The graphics, gameplay, and music are all reasonably close to the arcade original. No, it's not a one-to-one port or anything like that, but in 1992 terms, on a minuscule, for the time, 4 megabit cartridge, this was pretty excellent. Genesis Cadash is definitely worth a look and still worth playing through today. Alright, this is kind of a weird one. Chase HQ 2 for the Genesis came out in 1992. It was known as Super HQ in Japan, but it isn't really an arcade port, though the name is similar to the 1992 arcade second follow-up to Chase HQ, which was known as Super Chase Criminal Termination in Japan. That game also came out in 1992, so even though they're not the same, I figured, hey, why not see what the home game was competing with in the arcades at that time? Genesis Chase HQ 2 is really more like a slightly updated version of the original Chase HQ, with selectable cars and some gameplay enhancements. Visually, it's not even close to the first arcade Chase HQ game, and as you can see, it's a far cry from the third one that we're looking at here that came out the same year as this cartridge. The first 3 arcade Chase HQ titles were on systems that contained hardware scaling, giving them a visual style similar to Sega's Super Scaler arcade titles. The Genesis just couldn't compete with those boards on a technical level. So how is the game on its own merits, or at least compared to other driving games on the system? It's okay. It's not super great or anything, and it's not one that I've often come back to over the years. I don't find the driving mechanics all that fun, nor am I really into ramming the enemy cars at the end of a level. But if that's your thing and you enjoy the arcade originals or other home ports of Chase HQ, you may get a kick out of this one. But it definitely loses the visual thrill of the arcade games, and for me, I'm just not all that happy with what's left. In 1987, Taito unleashed the giant 3-screened arcade cabinet containing Darius onto the world. It's a pretty early and typical side-scrolling shooter that feels archaic by today's standards. It was ported to a few systems back in its day, but the first Darius didn't make its way to the Genesis until 2019. That's right, 2019. You see, this port of Darius was included as a new game on the first Sega Genesis Mini, which was released in 2019. It started life as a homebrew project that Sega picked up. It's on what will be considered a massive 32 megabit cartridge, and aside from the play area being shrunk to a reasonable one screen, this game is often indistinguishable either graphically or musically from the arcade original. It really shows how amazing Genesis titles could have been with the modern day tools that we have now, and without the restrictions of having to release games on much smaller 4, 8, or even 16 megabit cartridges due to the cost back then. If you're a fan of Darius, you'll absolutely love this port. It runs on regular Genesis hardware, and I'm not getting into any of this, but you can extract the ROM from the Genesis Mini and run it on a real system or any of the better emulators for PC and other platforms. It adds new options not present in the original game too. In fact, the only thing holding this excellent port back at all is just that it's based on a game that's not all that great. As a port, Darius for the Genesis is an absolute A+. As a game, it's more like a C. Is it worth checking out? Oh, absolutely. It's just one of the many excellent newer Genesis titles. Oh, Darius also had a port to the PC Engine in Japan that was a special dual turbo chip game that also worked on the Super Graphics that was supposed to enhance it a little bit to reduce some flicker and stuff. That version is actually fairly close to this one, but it's not quite as good. And the sound in particular, while really close, and much closer than most arcade ports to the PC Engine, doesn't quite sound as authentic as it could. But still, they did a good job on that one. Alright, so Darius wasn't such a great game, it was just okay. What about the 3-screened arcade sequel that came out in 1989, 2 years after the first game? Darius 2, also known as Sagaia, is a massive step up from the first Darius in every way. It looks, sounds, and plays way better. It's the game that really cemented Darius as one of the premier shoot-'em-up, or shmup, series in the entire industry. And as far as famous horizontally scrolling arcade shooter series go, I'd place Darius just behind the Gradius and R-Type series. Darius 2 was ported to the Mega Drive in Japan in 1990 and reached the Genesis as Sagaia in 1991 in the US. Thankfully, Taito wisely used an 8 megabit cartridge this time around, so this game still includes 26 levels just like the arcade original. However, the levels and layouts in this home port vary pretty greatly from the arcade original. There are also some modifications to the bosses as well. Since we've only got the one screen to deal with, Taito decided to sort of shrink the backgrounds and sprites to give the game a little bit more of a zoomed out look, allowing us to see more of the level at a time. The Genesis port of Darius 2/Sagaia looks okay, sounds really nice with great music, and the gameplay is right on target. It might not stand toe-to-toe with some of the Genesis's top-tier shooters, like the Thunder Force games, but Sagaia is a good game and any fan of the genre should make some time to play through it at least a few times to see what all those levels offer. It's definitely worth it, and it's a solid title. Go ahead, try it. I should probably also point out that there was a notable port of Darius 2 to the PC Engine Super CD in Japan. And that one has a much more zoomed in look and everything is bigger, which gives it a much more claustrophobic feel and makes it much harder to play in my opinion. I don't like that one nearly as much as the Genesis version, even though in some ways the production values are a lot higher. And I've got to say, I'm not a big fan of what they've done with some of the Red Book Audio music remixes either. So in the end, I actually think the Genesis port of Darius 2 is the better one, even though it might not look or sound quite as good as the PC Engine Super CD one. In 1988, Taito released Final Blow into the arcade. And get your mind out of the gutter, it's a boxing game. And not only that, it was a boxing game featuring absolutely gigantic main characters, which were really impressive visuals for the time it came out. But it also had some truly epically terrible gameplay. I mean, it looks great for its time of release, but this is just no fun at all. It was cool seeing it and to look at it when it was new, because there really wasn't anything like it. And overall, the presentation and everything is just top-notch. But playing it is about as much fun as rubbing sandpaper on your face. Now, Taito ported this game to the Mega Drive in 1989, and it came out as Final Blow in Japan. For some reason, Sega played this game and thought it would be a great idea to bring it to the US to the Genesis in 1990 as Buster Douglas Knockout Boxing. Now this was of course after the fluke win that Buster Douglas had against Mike Tyson in early 1990. James Buster Douglas was the world champion of boxing for all of about 5 minutes, losing in his very first title defense fight later that year to Evander Holyfield. Why the history lesson? Well, because Buster Douglas lost his title before this game even hit the Genesis in 1990. That's right, James Buster Douglas Boxing came out after Holyfield had already replaced him as the champion. This famously caused just a little smidge of embarrassment at Sega headquarters at the time. So the Genesis game here is visually scaled back slightly from the arcade original, as you can see, but it's still fairly impressive for when it came out. But just like the arcade game, the gameplay still stinks. It might be worth a look at as a curiosity, but this game just isn't any fun, and it's no competition for Punch-Out! You can safely pass on this one without missing anything. In the arcade in 1990, UPL released a really basic horizontal shmup called USAAF Mustang. Visually, it had some decent flair with lots of scrolling layers, and the sound was pretty impressive for the time it came out. The gameplay, while not terrible or anything, is just so rudimentary that it gets pretty boring after a few minutes. You only have one type of shot and one type of bomb. You can power them up a few times. It throws a lot of stuff on screen and is pretty technically competent. It's just not all that much fun. In 1991, Taito brought the game home to the Mega Drive in Japan as Fire Mustang. It's scaled back as you'd expect from the arcade game, but retains its play mechanics and a lot of its multiple layers of scrolling. As a fairly faithful home port, it has many of the same problems as the arcade original, except now it just looks and sounds a little worse. And I'd have to say, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this game. Unless you're a complete die-hard shooter fan, you're probably not going to get much out of Fire Mustang. It's the worst of the horizontally scrolling shoot-'em-ups in this video by quite a margin. It's not any kind of disaster, it's not a train wreck, it just feels so dull and uninspired that it pales in comparison to even the original Darius, which is saying something. Fire Mustang is not really worth playing today, but if you're a fan of the genre and haven't ever experienced it or seen it, you might get at least a little bit of fun out of it, so you may want to give it a look. For most people though, this isn't even really worth spending any time on. Hey look, it's the Flintstones! Taito published the Flintstones for the Genesis in the US in early 1993. This game wasn't exactly a hit when it was new. The platforming genre had grown a bit stale by the time it came out, and one-on-one fighting games were starting to take over gaming in a big way. And that shift in the preference of gamers at the time probably played a role in the Flintstones' fairly middling review scores during its time of release. In the intervening years, however, this game has had a bit of a second life thanks to a lot of positive buzz in the retro gaming community through forum posts, social media, and YouTube. So what's the deal then? How exactly is the Flintstones? I'd say it's not bad. I mean, honestly, I'm not sure why it's gotten the reputation it has among a lot of the Genesis retro community, but I'd say the game is alright. It's certainly not bad, and it has a few interesting gameplay quirks. But as far as character-driven action platformers on the Genesis go, I'd say there are a lot of other titles in the genre that I'd rather play than this one. Alright, I don't want to go all negative here. This one actually is pretty good, and I'd recommend trying it out for yourself to see if it's something that you might like. If you're a fan of platformers on the system and want something that's a little different than the average one, you'll probably enjoy this. It looks good, it sounds good, and the gameplay is generally fine even though it has a few moments that are a tad confusing. I don't think it quite deserves the praise I've seen it getting in recent years, but yeah, it's alright. I definitely recommend giving it a shot. In 1990, Taito unleashed this scrolling beat-em-up, Growl, into the arcades. In Japan, it was known as Ronark. There were versions that supported up to 4-player simultaneous play. So nearly every side-scrolling brawler of the era propelled you into action by having you rescue a kidnapped girlfriend or some other damsel in distress, or you were getting revenge for a girlfriend that was murdered. Pretty much all of the games have that same setup. Growl, on the other hand, has you saving animals from poachers. So yeah, points for originality if nothing else. Growl features relatively small characters, but man does it put a lot of enemies on the screen at once. Like probably more than any other game in the genre at the time. The gameplay isn't on par with the genre's biggest hits, like Double Dragon, Golden Axe, Final Fight, or Streets of Rage though. In 1991, Growl made its way onto the Genesis. Sadly, it's only one player on the Genesis, but at least it does retain all the selectable characters and gameplay elements of the arcade original, but it does switch a few minor things up here and there. Now let's talk about the quality of this port. Visually, it's a bit of a step down from the arcade original, as you can see. While Genesis Growl throws a lot of enemies on screen at once in some parts, it still isn't nearly as populated as the arcade game. The sound and music are also a bit of a step down from the arcade original, but definitely aren't bad. The biggest problem with Growl on the Genesis is that the play mechanics just don't feel like the arcade game, and they feel a lot worse. The fighting is noticeably less fluid, punching enemies just doesn't feel the same because the timing and the punch delay is just off in this version. And in order to avoid being hit by enemies, you have to do a lot of circling around to try and take them on one at a time. Now it's a shame, as this version of Growl would have been a really competent port otherwise, but I feel like the gameplay in this one is so badly damaged compared to the arcade original that it really sinks it, especially compared to other scrolling beat-em-ups on the system. Why wasn't this 2 players on Genesis, Taito? You have loads of enemies on the screen, surely you could have supported a second player character. Anyway, if you absolutely love scrolling beat-em-ups, check it out for something a little different, but I'd recommend playing the arcade game over the Genesis port. On Genesis, it's tolerable, but really, it's quite a letdown. Taito, Williams, and Midway ushered Hit the Ice into the arcade in 1990. It's a side-view hockey game with 3 players on each team, and it supported 4-player simultaneous gameplay. It features large characters, roughhousing your opponents, and even getting into fights where you can temporarily knock one of your opposing players out. In the arcade, you got so much time when inserting a coin, and you could play a total of a 3-period game if you kept inserting more money. Personally, I got bored with the arcade game long before the timer ever ran out anyway. Hit the Ice arrived on the Genesis much later in 1993. It doesn't quite look or sound as good as the arcade game from 3 years earlier. As a port, it's mostly okay. You can customize more stuff than the arcade version, and you can actually play an entire game without having to insert credits. The problem is that there's just not a whole lot to it. Also, when making a trip home to the Genesis, it only supports 2 players instead of 4 like the arcade original. If you're a fan of arcadey sports games like NBA Jam, you might have a little fun with this one, especially playing against a friend. As for me, I'm just not much of a fan of this game and feel like it's pretty dull overall. If you're not a fan of the sport or competitive play against another human being, you probably won't enjoy Hit the Ice very much. Okay, I know I said I wasn't really going to cover games distributed by Taito in the arcade if they didn't have anything to do with the home ports, but I'm making an exception for this one because it's too crazy not to look at. Arcade Insector X is this cutesy-wootsy side-scrolling shooter that you see here. It was originally developed by Hot B and arrived in arcades in 1988. A year later, Hot B ported the game to the Mega Drive themselves and published it in Japan, but they decided to make a few changes, and now the game looks like this. Yeah, this is the same game. Crazy, right? Sage's Creation published the game here in the US. On the Genesis, we got a more serious shmup, with uncutesified characters and enemies even though the backgrounds aren't really all that different in most cases. I'd also say the Genesis port definitely feels more refined than the arcade version when it comes to gameplay. The control just feels tighter and more responsive. Insector X had a lot of competition when it came out, and with its complete lack of flashy effects that were utterly commonplace at the time, like basic parallax scrolling, there was really no way it could compete with early releases like Thunder Force 2, or even contemporary releases like Thunder Force 3 that just plain blew it out of the water. Now in the end, Insector X isn't a bad game at all. If you've never made your way through this bug-themed shmup, I recommend giving it a whirl. It'll feel like it's really hard at first, but if you stick with it, you'll definitely get the hang of it and make progress. The gameplay is good, the music is really good, it's just the visuals feel like they belong more on a PC Engine than the Genesis. Still, in the end, it's a pretty good game and it's worth playing. Hello dear viewer, do you like mediocrity? Are you tired of original games that do exciting new things or update existing genres in a meaningful way? If you answered yes to those questions, then boy do I have a game for you! This is Master of Weapon, an overhead shooter that Taito subjected the arcades to back in 1989. Alright, I'll stop. There was quite a glut of overhead shmups that were kind of dull and generic in the arcade at this time, and Master of Weapon did absolutely nothing to really distinguish itself to make it stand out from the crowd. The weapon power-ups here are mostly kind of boring, the levels are pretty unimaginative, the music is dull, and the graphics are just alright. In fact, I'd say there's really only one thing that's kind of cool and interesting in this game that's not typical, and that's the fact that you can bomb and destroy some buildings on the ground at times. Master of Weapon was ported to the Mega Drive in 1990 and was not released in the US. And, well, I can understand why. It's a decent enough port, don't get me wrong. The problem was, as with a few of these games we've looked at today, the original is just not all that good. It feels a bit amateurish compared to other games in the genre from the same era. And in modern times, aside from possibly wanting a dose of nostalgia, I don't see why anyone would play this over something like, say, Musha, which is immeasurably better. So Master a Weapon on the Mega Drive suffers a bit of a downgrade in every department, but nothing too severe. It captures the gameplay from the arcade version pretty well, and adds a few minor enhancements. With so many great titles in the genre on the Genesis, I can't really recommend that anyone play this one. It's a pretty dull, low-tier shooter that most people most likely won't enjoy these days. But if you're an absolute shmup nut and you missed out on this one because of its Japan-only release and are just learning about it for the first time right now, you might enjoy going through it once or twice, but it's definitely not going to be one of your favorites. Next up, we have Mystical Fighter. Mystical Fighter is an original scrolling beat-em-up that was released in 1991. And, well, it's super weird. You play as a kabuki wandering around beating up all kinds of demons and warriors. The fighting mechanics are alright. They're nothing special, but they aren't bad either. There's a fun move where you pick up enemies and just swing them around before launching them way the hell off the screen, knocking down any opponents that they come into contact with. Visually, Mystical Fighter is fine. I mean, it's a bit on the dark and dreary side, but the detail is okay, and it's easy to tell what characters are and what's happening. And there are some truly gigantic bosses in this game, some of the biggest I've ever seen in the genre on any platform from that time. But as a game, would anyone want to play this over something like Streets of Rage 2 or even Golden Axe? Nah, it's not even close. Mystical Fighter is okay for a change of pace. It's a little above average, and based on the weirdness factor alone, you might consider it worth checking out. If you like the genre, you'll almost definitely have at least a little fun with this game once you come to grips with its controls. So yeah, go ahead, give it a shot, you'll probably like it. It's aight. Taito was pretty famous for its late 80s and early 90s cutesy arcade action platform games. Stuff like Bobble, Rainbow Islands, Parasol Stars, Liquid Kids, Rodland, and more. The New Zealand story was another in the mold of those titles and was released into the arcades in 1988. This one features levels that you can scroll in any direction and has you playing as a Kiwi that fires arrows from a bow, which can be replaced by other weapon power-ups, and you can jump onto a number of different mounts that let you fly around the level. It's a fun little game despite some rough edges, especially with some sloppy collision detection on platforms and spikes. The New Zealand story was ported to the Mega Drive in 1990 and published by Taito themselves. Strangely enough, the level layouts were based on a prototype of the arcade game, so they don't match up with the released arcade version exactly. Now, the New Zealand story was ported to a lot of computers and consoles around 1989 and 1990, and most of the other versions are pretty good too. There are very few ports that aren't well done, so it's nice to see a strong showing on the Mega Drive also. The 16-bit Sega port of the New Zealand story was never released in the West, which is kind of surprising. If you've never experienced this game and are up for something that's a little different and fast-paced and cute, chances are you'll find something to like here. Just be prepared for a few unfair deaths in some places where you might slip through walls. Check it out. So I just mentioned Rainbow Islands in the last segment. Let's talk about the Genesis port of Rainbow Islands next. In 1988, Taito followed up the arcade smash Bobble with a completely different cutesy action game called Rainbow Islands. These days, it's more famous for its copyright-infringing music than anything else. Some people absolutely adore Rainbow Islands. Personally, I think it's just alright. It's nowhere near as much fun as Bobble. Rainbow Islands was ported to a buttload of systems in the late 80s and early 90s, but the Mega Drive in Japan got a very special port called Rainbow Islands Extra version in 1990. First off, this is a port of the arcade game, if you play in the normal mode. It's regular Rainbow Islands with the original soundtrack and everything. Some of the background colors have been changed, but other than that, it's really close to the arcade original as you can see. What's the extra version, you ask? Well, apparently the devs at Taito were on every drug imaginable when they decided to replace enemies in the game's world with characters from other Taito games and even update some of the music to parody their own games. In World 1, for example, you'll see that the game uses enemies from Darius and features the background music from Stage 3 of the first Darius title. And yeah, it's as weird as it sounds. When you get to the end of the first world, the boss is replaced by the second stage boss from Darius. Like I said, weird. Each world is themed after some other Taito game, it's not just Darius that gets this treatment. Anyway, Rainbow Islands fans will definitely enjoy this one. Taito fans will enjoy the weirdness of the extra version mode. In the end, it's alright. You know what game I really liked in the mid-80s? Rastan. It had amazing music, it had a great Conan the Barbarian-like aesthetic, and I was all about swords and sorcery stuff in those days. You know what game completely sucks? Rastan Saga 2, also known in some regions as Nastar. Jeez, Taito, what the hell happened here? Rastan 2 hit the arcades at the end of 1988. It made its way to the Mega Drive and Genesis in 1990 and 91 respectively. Taito replaced the small characters of the original Rastan with this big giant doofus you see here. In the process, they added stiff controls with a severe lag from the point you hit jump until Rastan actually jumps. Gee, great. They also made it so it's super easy to bump Rastan's head on the ceiling, so there are platforming parts in the arcade version especially that are maddening, because you have to position your character just right to avoid falling to your death over and over. The Genesis port of Rastan 2 is kind of okay. It lacks pretty much all of the speech and voice samples from the arcade game, and visually it resembles it, even though they cut down the graphics noticeably. The sound on the Genesis is pretty good, but it doesn't match the much more advanced sound hardware of the arcade original. The biggest problem with this game is that the gameplay is just atrocious. It's slow and plodding without any trace of fun or excitement. But at least the jumping feels better in the Genesis version than the arcade original. If you loved Rastan and somehow have never came across this sequel, thank your lucky stars, because this game stinks. It wasn't acceptable in 1990, and it sure isn't acceptable now. Do yourself a favor and just avoid this one. If you must, watch a long play on YouTube or something. Rastan Saga 2 also made its way to the PC Engine. That version only came out in Japan. It's similar to the Mega Drive port, and it's also similarly bad, because it's based on a game that is bad. As to which one's better, the Mega Drive or the PC Engine, this one's a little bit of a toss-up. I think the Mega Drive version plays slightly better than the PC Engine version. But neither one of them is any good. What you're looking at now is Saint Sword. It's an original action-adventure game for Sega's 16-bit platform that came out in 1991, and I was really excited for it after it was announced and I'd seen screenshots in magazines. I loved Rastan back in the day, just like I told you in the last segment, and I was really looking forward to Saint Sword, which looked like it was going to be sort of an update to the formula used in that game. When I finally got my hands on this game, used from Blockbuster a little bit after it came out, I couldn't help but feel let down. Saint Sword is another title that isn't necessarily bad, it's just not what it should have been either. The attack mechanics with swinging your sword are just not all that good, and they detract from the gameplay. Hits don't feel solid like they should. It also feels like the game was programmed by a second-tier development team inside Taito. There's just this aura of sloppiness that kind of pervades the whole thing. And the graphics are just so-so, the music is so-so, and the gameplay is, well, so-so. Now it's got a cool transformation gimmick that lets you temporarily become a centaur, a winged flying birdman, or a fish-tailed merman that can swim around water with the greatest of ease. Now I thought this was a great idea, and the forms are very useful in specific situations. The biggest problem with Saint Sword is its gameplay structure. You wander around giant levels looking for a key that unlocks a closed exit door that leads to a boss. Once you manage to find the key, an arrow kind of points you toward the exit, but very often, the arrow is deceiving, because you can't just take a straight path in the direction that it's pointing. You might have to go up or down and then detour in the complete opposite direction, and fun stuff like that. In the end, Saint Sword is a humdrum action platformer that is probably nobody's favorite game in the genre, but at least it's better than Rastan 2. Is it worth taking a look at today? Maybe. I mean, you might enjoy going through it once or twice. It's another one of those games that's interesting to kind of mess around with, but like I said just a moment ago, it's probably nobody's favorite, and it most likely won't be your favorite either. But go ahead, check it out. Alright, next up, this game here was known as Space Invaders 90 for the Mega Drive in Japan, and Space Invaders 91 for the Genesis in the US. And while you may think that it's an arcade port, it isn't. It's an original console title. There was never an arcade version of Space Invaders 90 or 91. Now before you scream at me, oh yes there was, let me tell you, you might be confusing this game with Super Space Invaders 91, which was in fact ported to the Game Gear and Super Nintendo. But that's a totally different game from this one. So how is Space Invaders 90/91? It's kind of meh. It's definitely on the bland side. Now Taito did add some new features to this one compared to the ancient original arcade Space Invaders. We've got power-ups, there are different enemy firing patterns, different types of enemies, and things like that. In some levels, they even throw in groups of enemies that are moving in opposite directions, and they'll lower when either group of enemies hits its side of the screen. We've also got better sound effects and actual in-game music. But all of this, it just doesn't feel like it was enough to make this game modern for the time that it came out. For example, if we look at another similar game, Galaga 88, that launched in the arcade during that year with a PC Engine / TurboGrafx port that came out in 1990 in the US, that's a much more satisfying update to Galaga than Space Invaders 91 is to Space Invaders. So yeah, Space Invaders 90/91, it's not a terrible game, it's just very basic. If you're looking for something that plays more akin to the classics, you'll probably get some fun out of this one. But personally for me, I just didn't maintain much interest past the first 5 or so levels. Next up, we've got Thunder Fox. Taito released Thunder Fox into the arcades in 1990. And, well, from all the research I've done, it apparently wasn't all that successful. I only ever saw it in the arcades a few times. And that's too bad, because conceptually, the ideas in this game sound great. Imagine Russian Attack, also known as Green Beret, mixed with Rolling Thunder, mixed with a Strider, mixed with some horizontally scrolling shooting sections. And I love all that stuff. But you know what I don't love? Thunder Fox. Do you know why I don't love Thunder Fox? Because the execution of everything in it just isn't quite there. You get swarmed by enemies way too easily, and the play mechanics are just too rough, they're not refined. There's nothing special about them. It's brutally unfair, which really just takes away from the fun. Taito released a port of Thunder Fox to the Mega Drive and Genesis in 1991. The graphics and gameplay are pretty dramatically scaled down in this one compared to the arcade original. First, and most glaringly, the game runs at about half the frame rate of the arcade game, and it is very noticeable. Next up, it loses the 2-player simultaneous gameplay of the arcade original. Next up, it loses the horizontally scrolling shooter segments from the arcade game. And then next up, it loses some background detail and scrolling layers from parts of the arcade game. And also, there are some boss fight changes. Yeah, Thunder Fox on the Genesis is more scaled down from the arcade original than maybe any other game in this video. And it's kinda crazy since this one is actually on an 8 megabit cartridge. Despite all the cuts, Thunder Fox on the Genesis still isn't bad, and it recreates the major on-foot gameplay segments of the arcade game pretty well. Still, this is a game that oozed potential in both the arcade and on the Genesis, but it feels like Taito just didn't quite get the ideas out the way that they wanted to. With all the ideas in this game, if they had gotten them right, it would have been a huge hit, I think. So I'd say, go ahead and give Thunder Fox a try. It's a little hard to get into, but once you get accustomed to it, it's not a bad military action game. It just doesn't stand up to better titles in the genre, which, actually, I hate to say it, but it's pretty common among a lot of these Taito games. Taito went on a kick in the late 80s, sorry about the pun, releasing some updates to old concepts with better graphics and sound and updated play mechanics. Taito went back to that well again for Ultimate Kicks, also known as Volfeed. Taito tossed Volfeed into the arcades in 1989. If you enjoyed classic Kicks, it was an update to that formula, essentially playing similarly to the original game while adding more enemies and various power-ups. You have to fill in as much of the screen as you can. Once you get to over 80%, or if you're lucky, destroy the main enemy in the level, you move on to the next level. The arcade game uses a vertical screen layout, known as portrait mode these days, and is incredibly hard. Taito released the home version of Ultimate Kicks / Volfeed onto the Mega Drive and Genesis in 1991. And while the quality of the graphics is similar, you can definitely tell that the backgrounds and enemies have changed quite a bit in the home version of the game. The Genesis version is definitely a little less frustrating than the infuriating arcade original. It's one of those games that you can pick up and play for maybe 5 or 10 minutes and feel like you've had your fill. Or when you get into it, you might even spend 30 or 40 minutes on it like I did while recording this video. Now, I would be remiss if I didn't mention the annoying droning sound that the enemy makes in every level, and this was pretty ill-advised for both the arcade and home versions. I can't believe Taito didn't at least include an option to disable that. So Ultimate Kicks / Volfeed is definitely not a game for everyone. I especially enjoyed it because I really liked playing Kicks back in the day, and this was a fun, if slightly frustrating, update to the game's formula. If you're used to more traditional 16-bit games like scrolling shooters, run and guns, or cutesy platformers, this one might not be for you. But hey, if you're willing to try out something different, give Ultimate Kicks a whirl. I think a lot of you will probably enjoy it, at least for a few minutes at a time. Alright, how about a bonus game? This one's a bootleg, so it's not an official Taito release. I repeat, not an official release. What you're looking at here is Super Bubble Bobble MD, which was released somewhere around 1995. It's sort of an update to the basic Bubble Bobble formula, and even has Bub and Bob as selectable characters, along with a couple of anime characters, Crayon Shin-chan and Doraemon. Now, a lot of bootlegs are total garbage. So how is this one? Well, it's not total garbage, but it does have problems, as you probably expected. First off, collision detection kinda sucks, and there are some places where you absolutely can't avoid taking a hit and dying. In comparison to real Bubble Bobble games, enemies never shake out of or break bubbles after you capture them. You can't jump on bubbles that you shoot out and use them as platforms like you could in the original Bubble Bobble, and the levels are totally different here. But I've gotta say, most of them aren't too bad, minus the mandatory hits. The graphics, sound, and music are all actually pretty decent. It's also got this weird mechanic where you can just hold the attack button, start to fill up with air, and then float up to reach high platforms that otherwise you would have no way to get to. Now this is also kind of annoyingly slow, but it's also funny the first few times you've seen it, if nothing else. Now once you come to grips with Super Bubble Bobble MD's quirks, it's actually pretty decent and one of the best bootleg hacks I've probably played on the system. And hey, it's definitely more fun than stuff like Rastan 2 or Master of Weapon. Alright, so there you go. That's every official Taito release on the Mega Drive/Genesis. Quite an interesting batch of games this time around, don't you think? So the thing about Taito is, they absolutely have their place in the annals of gaming history, right? I mean, they made Space Invaders, which was one of gaming's first monster hits. And they had huge games they released in the arcade that they distributed, which included stuff like Double Dragon and Renegade. But I don't feel like Taito ever really secured their place as a long-term, top-tier developer. Like, I don't think they ever reached the levels of a Sega or a Capcom or a Konami. And these days, Taito are probably best known for one series, Darius. It's their one series of games to really see consistent releases over the years. Now, I'm not saying Taito released a lot of bad games or anything like that. I think they're probably more of a B-tier developer than an A-tier developer, though. So in the end, there's quite a few games on this list that are pretty good and are absolutely worth checking out. It's just that Taito doesn't really have any games on the Genesis/Mega Drive that are at the absolute pinnacle of their genre. And that'll do it for this video, my retro gaming friends. If you enjoyed the video, please toss it a like and share it online somewhere. If you haven't yet, please subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you'll never miss one of my videos. If you really enjoy my videos and want to support the work that I do here, you can do that over on Patreon or Ko-fi. The links follow at the end of this video and are also down below in the description. With that, I'll say thanks for watching, and see me later.